session with four former, now retired Foreign Service officers. I will briefly introduce them, but the theme of today's seminar is looking back over the last 35 years or so at the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, including the aftermath of the failed coup in Moscow in August 1991 that led to momentous changes over the subsequent 4 months, including the fate of the KGB, which will be one theme of today's session. But in general, we're looking back at U.S. Relations with what became the former Soviet Union, first 4 months still the Soviet Union, and then the largest of the republics, Russia, but also other republics. And so today's speakers, and I will go in the order in which they will speak. First, Andrew Goodman, who is a retired former Foreign Service officer who served primarily in positions connected with the Soviet Union and then later Russia, also dealt with German reunification, an important role there, and served for many years, is now living in New York State. Then next will be George Kroll, who again also served in positions connected with the Soviet Union, including in Leningrad as the Soviet Union was breaking up. And he later served under three presidents as ambassador in former Soviet republics. I believe in order they were Belarus, Uzbekistan, and then finally Kazakhstan up till 2018. Then next will be Louis Sell, who is a Foreign Service officer serving in countries that ceased to exist, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. And he has also written about his experiences, then published a couple of interesting books on the fate of those countries, both Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, and I would recommend those. And then finally, my longtime colleague, Thomas Simons, who was the head of the Soviet Union office in the State Department during the 1980s, and then was later appointed ambassador to Poland and was there when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and later on served as ambassador to Pakistan, and has developed considerable expertise on Central Asia, the former Soviet Central Asia. So they will be speaking in that order, about 12 to 15 minutes each, and then we will open it for discussion. So please, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to join this august panel. I want to start basically talking about the demise of the KGB. The KGB had reached a high point of influence, I think, or one of its high points of influence, when Yuri Andropov, its former chairman, became chairman of the Communist Party, which occurred actually shortly before I came to Moscow in 1985. I was there through his brief reign, also the brief reign of Chernenko, and then when the first 6 months of Gorbachev. And Gorbachev's reforms affected not only Soviet society, but affected the KGB. It therefore was not all that surprising that by 1991, when we had the aborted coup against Gorbachev, it basically was led by individuals from the KGB. The result of this coup was actually pretty disastrous for the KGB. Their participation aroused the suspicion of any number of politicians, most notably Boris Yeltsin, who set about with the dismantlement of the KGB into its component parts. Except it wasn't the whole KGB. Thousands of KGB staffers were put out on the street with basically nothing to do. So that was one calamity. The second calamity was almost simultaneously the collapse of the Russian economy, which basically meant the pauperization of KGB staff who remained in office. And the fact that they were now impoverished meant that they were subject to co-optation and corruption which I can say from personal experience in St. Petersburg, it worked actually quite well. That through any number of means, we were able to co-opt them for our own purposes. So what was the KGB going to do to restore itself to prosperity and influence? Well, one major route was turning to a life of crime. For some KGB members, this was not very difficult. Under the Soviet Union, the KGB had controlled prostitution in major Soviet cities, directed against Western businessmen and diplomats. And when the Soviet economy collapsed, those individuals simply privatized. They no longer ran prostitutes on behalf of the Soviet government, they ran it on behalf of themselves. The other main avenue that the ex-KGB sought was like former military officers and former athletes. They formed security firms. These security firms offered protection to foreign businesses and to individuals in their living quarters. In essence, these were protection rackets, although in fairness, one has to say that many of the KGB security firms actually offered value for money. They didn't just penetrate the companies the way, say, the ethnic Chechen or Georgian gangs did, but they actually offered real protection to individuals who ran afoul of other crime groups, which was the main problem there. You had competing crime groups, and the groups had to resolve things between them. The other alternative was to join government and politics and to seek more influence. And that meant running for the federal legislature. It also meant at a local level running for office. While I was there in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s, a number of the so-called mayors of the local districts in St. Petersburg were actually ex-KGB officers. The same was true with the newly created position of presidential representative that Boris Yeltsin created. These were individuals as represented the federal administration to the local governments. And for example, the presidential representative to the Leningrad Oblast, that is the general region around St. Petersburg, was in fact an ex-KGB officer. The other route was to get into government at all different levels through key appointments. And the sterling example of that, of course, is Vladimir Putin. I first met Putin in fall of 1999 on a security issue that I really can't discuss. But he and I got to be, I don't want to say friends, that's the wrong term, but we had numerous encounters. We saw each other multiple times during the week, sometimes multiple times during the day. And I had an opportunity to have many informal conversations with him. Putin gave no indication at that time that he had any political ambitions, although he made clear that his view was that Russia needed to regain the position the Soviet Union had enjoyed during the height of the Cold War as the main rival to the United States and as the hegemon in Eastern Europe. It's not clear exactly why or how Putin was appointed. There are many stories about this. My own view is that, and the story that makes the most sense to me, is that Putin obtained his position because the KGB wanted to infiltrate the apparatus of the leading Democratic politician in St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, who became mayor. And at the same time, Sobchak was looking to cover his rear end through links to the security services. Putin and Sobchak had at least a passing acquaintance with one another when Putin was a student at Leningrad University. And so he was the right man in the right spot. And he was appointed to the city's foreign affairs department, although for a long time, no one could quite figure out exactly what his duties were. He did then become, in June of 1991, the head of that department, but he was almost derailed later at the end of that year by a scandal of food for resources, which involved the export of Russian resources in exchange for badly needed foodstuffs for the city. The resources were sent overseas, large commissions were paid, but no food was actually delivered to the city. This prompted a parliamentary, that is the St. Petersburg parliamentary investigation, which concluded that Putin was at fault. Putin should be fired, but Sobchak refused to do so. There's never been a very good explanation as to why Sobchak did not fire Putin. My, again, best explanation is, why would Putin be released if Putin was the liaison with the security services? Sobchak was not about to cut ties and anger the security services by removing the liaison. Instead, what happened, shortly after I arrived in late 1992, Putin was elevated to the position of deputy mayor. And initially, he was one of 5 deputy mayors, and he was the lowest ranking one on the totem pole. But he began to consolidate power. He brought in ex-KGB associates into key positions, such as Igor Sechin, his chief of staff. And as he began to accumulate power, he brought the tax police under his purview, brought the organized crime police under his purview. Basically, everybody in the St. Petersburg elite was scared to death of Putin. It was said reliably that he was collecting information on people, which he used at appropriate times to get them out of his way. And all the ranking deputy mayors, with the exception of Alexei Kudrin, who was valued because of his economic and financial expertise, all the others walked the political plank. They all left politics. Many left the city, as did Putin opponents in the St. Petersburg legislature, because of threats against their lives. The situation so developed, but towards the end of 1993, beginning of 1994, as reliable insiders at City Hall told me, it was no longer Mayor Sobchak who was giving instructions to Putin, but it was rather Putin who was giving instructions to Mayor Sobchak. And it's important to note at this time that all the behavior that we later think characterized Putin's reign as president, he exhibited in St. Petersburg. He manipulated elections. For example, I witnessed ballot stuffing. He had a total disdain for political parties, who he said to me were simply beholden to special interests and could not be trusted. He viewed the press as a tool for propaganda and actually dictated articles to the press, or supposedly ghost wrote certain articles himself. He exerted tight control over business, and if any foreign company was making too much money, Putin removed them. He sicked the tax police on the owners of the Grand Hotel Europa with a tax bill that would have bankrupted the mother company in Sweden. He indulged in all kinds of corrupt schemes to obtain wealth. These have been documented in several books about him. One thing that was not particularly documented is that Putin and his cronies were not that adept at laundering money. He had to be shown how to do this by an American expat who had been run out of New York for misusing a charity fund for this purpose. But he learned quickly. And of course, Putin threatened and imprisoned opponents, and sometimes had resorted to physical beatings of opponents. Although, again, one should stress, Putin did not have anybody killed in St. Petersburg, at least not that I'm aware of. The killing of opponents only started to take place once he was in power in Moscow. Now, Putin's future, in theory, was in doubt after Anatoly Sobchak was defeated for re-election in 1996. It was a political campaign that Putin managed, although Putin claims he only came late to managing the campaign. But in any event, Sobchak was defeated. Putin regarded that he was out-tricked by his opponents in the election. And the next time Putin surfaces is in Moscow. And again, there are stories of how and why did Putin get his position in Moscow. Well, again, the best explanation that I have is that the presidential administration, while Putin was in power in St. Petersburg, presidential administration was interested in obtaining a certain property for its use. It was owned by a foreigner who actually considered himself to be a friend of Putin, and Putin arranged for the expropriation of the property and its giving to the federal government without any payment of compensation, although the owner later pursued the matter through the courts, international courts, and actually obtained some compensation. But in any event, Putin had shown his loyalty to the presidential administration, and on that basis, is my understanding, on that basis, he achieved and got a position in Moscow. Once in Moscow, Putin endeared himself to Yeltsin through his loyalty, and he manipulated his way to power. He learned from his mistakes in the 1996 election. He learned from his mistakes in being outfoxed by Russian mafia, for example, when in St. Petersburg they tried to take over casinos or the city port, and Putin learned and corrected his behavior. It looked to me, in essence, as the famous saying goes, it was deja vu all over again. And I recall being shortly after he got into power, I was at a conference. People said, well, Putin is just another member of the merry-go-round of prime ministers that Yeltsin was appointing. And I recall saying to them, no, you don't understand what's actually going on here. It's Mr. Yeltsin who's going to go and Mr. Putin who's going to stay. And that, of course, is what happened. And so through my encounters with Putin, what I would say, in effect, his rise in St. Petersburg, his takeover of the government there, served in essence as a dress rehearsal for what he was going to do once he got to Moscow. And that, in essence, is how it panned out. And once he got to power in Moscow, he set about recreating an updated version of Andropov's KGB state. Andropov had been his hero. He freely admitted that to me and to other people. And one would have to say that the security services reign supreme in Russia of today. So Putin has succeeded and is the sterling example, and has brought, I think, the security services, notably now the main successor to the KGB, the FSB, back into its position of prominence, prosperity, and power. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thank you very much, and also for sticking to the time. Please, George.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I wanted to concentrate actually most of my talk on, my experiences and relationship of dealing with, the successor organizations, the KGB and the other post-Soviet republics. I was in Leningrad before Andrew Goodman got there, and so I dealt with Vladimir Putin when he first appeared on the scene. I would point out that when I was in Leningrad at the consulate, Vladimir Putin was back from Germany and was in charge of the office at Leningrad State University that dealt with foreign students, which was understandably a position for a KGB officer. And I remember he even interviewed the daughter of our consul general at the time, who was applying for a program. And she got in after being interviewed by Vladimir Putin. It was also important to note that the KGB itself was not a monolithic organization. There were regional differences as well as differences within the Russian Federation, which did not have a KGB organization as a federation itself. Unlike the other republics, they did have KGB operations. But in Leningrad, the head of the Bolshoi Dome, which was the KGB headquarters, actually just around the block from our consulate, was himself a very experienced KGB officer, had been in Germany, hence you could imagine his relationship with Vladimir Putin. And they had rather, I would say, it was hard to know what their relationship was with the rest of the KGB, and to realize that the KGB also had control over the office that dealt with foreign and representations in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and the organization that dealt with it. So the idea was, as the KGB is, it's controlling, being the sword and the shield of the regime, both with a large imprint on dealing with domestic control over dissidents and the like, which Louis will talk about, but also with defending against the foreign sort of spies or those that might seek to threaten the regime, and that's why they were active in St. Petersburg, where there was actually a major training center for the KGB in St. Petersburg on things like surveillance, and the consulate was kind of a guinea pig for a lot of these officers as they were learning the tricks of the trade. But there was, however, a certain amount of between the Moscow KGB, if you will, center and Leningrad too, that came out, and even Putin in an interview he gave later did say that his grouping was with Leningrad. Moscow was Moscow, and they kind of feathered their own nests, and to break into the center was difficult for anyone coming from even Leningrad. So that even when the coup happened in August, and I happened to be in the Baltic republics because that was part of our reporting district at the time, and that week in August, the KGB head in Leningrad refused the orders of Khrushchev, who was a member of the actual coup plotters, and did not set his organization to arrest or to threaten or do what the coup plotters had told them for whatever reason. And Vladimir Putin by that time was in the administration, close to Sobchak, largely because Sobchak was also from Leningrad State University, a law professor. His own father was a KGB officer. Why Sobchak was born in Chita, and so they had a deep relationship professionally at Leningrad State University, and certainly knew each other and worked with each other. And that when Putin came in to head the Foreign Affairs Office, which I had to deal with subsequently, it was kind of like a fresh air coming in, because he was decisive, confident, and made decisions, and also shielded Sobchak from a lot of the many delegations that were descending on St. Petersburg after the demise of the Soviet Union. And so, we knew that he would follow through on matters of logistics that we all had, because most of these delegations were interested in tourism and also in business. And he became basically the gatekeeper for Sobchak. But I would like to turn to the other republics. Now, as I said, I went to the Baltic republics before they became independent. It was quite clear that the KGB operations there, although they were manned by people from, the ethnics from the Baltic republics, they were not under control of the if you will, the nationalist forces that had taken control of the parliament, and also were nominally in control of the government. But they didn't control, that is, the nationalist force control the local KGBs or the military. It was always unsure what their relationship was with the police services. And plus, these local KGBs had immense sort of resources, but also large thousands of people who were informants within the various ministries throughout society, even within the dissident movements that later became the parliamentarians and government people. It's very interesting to see. Now, when I got at the middle of 1990, my predecessor had been basically tossed out of the Baltic republics after the March elections that brought sort of nationalists into power in the Baltic republics. But when I came at the end of the summer, we decided, well, let's see if we can go back in. And I have to say that I never got any resistance from the Soviet authorities for going and traveling in the Baltics. None of us did. We had to submit our note to the nominal foreign affairs office in Leningrad, which we understood was reporting to the KGB and not so much to the foreign ministry in Moscow. And they never stopped us. I never had an incident. We traveled alone. I don't know of any of my colleagues that had any kind of run-ins or intimidation or like. I certainly didn't, and I was there, all the way through, August of 1991, and it was rather peculiar because I was always expecting or thinking that at some point they're going to stop this or do something to intimidate, but they never did. And I found it peculiar, but also within these republics, you could see that, for instance, the little foreign ministries that they had their sort of what we would think would be, KGB agents who were sort of the members of these foreign affairs groups, and they had to work with their new bosses, or at least the foreign minister who was not KGB or even Communist Party. And so you wondered, to whom did they report? And they were kind of sidelined to a certain extent by as you will, the local leadership, but never gotten rid of, because they would set up, meetings and programs. And of course, where we stayed and the places we stayed were all known as being places that, that we were watched over and surveilled, but never really intimidated or stopped in our relationships that we were in throughout this whole period. In fact, I found out that there was going to be something of a coup in August of 19 from a Latvian parliamentarian who told me, over a month or so before, something was going to happen that day, that he'd heard from Moscow and the like too. And presumably that was all understood by, anyone who was surveilling or listening into our conversation. But nothing happened untoward. So I found that peculiar. Now, then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to know, well, what happened to these security services? Well, there was no lustration, as you found perhaps in the Czech Republic later. I don't even think in Poland, Tom, you would know this better, that they actually sort of opened the files as to know who all was reporting, informing, and the like as well. I think this is an interesting history to look at in these republics as to how did they transform and what happened to all these people. I know that in Lithuania, several prominent people were exposed as having been informants, if not agents of the KGB, people who had been very close to the leadership, like of Landsbergis and like as well, who were kind of forced out of politics and like. But again, the habits of using a security service for control of your regime, protection of your regime, was, I think, very deeply ingrained in even the subsequent governments that came in. Now, I went then from Leningrad, got a train to go to my new assignment in Kiev, Ukraine. Interesting there, because that was a key part of the KGB world. And the SBU, as it was led by career KGB officers. There was Yevgen Marchuk, who eventually became a prime minister of Ukraine. And it was a large operation, very close with the Russians during the Soviet period. But it was always a question as to what were their loyalties. They had, of course, a large number of informants for control over Ukrainian nationalists and the like as well. Throughout the countryside. They did not have perhaps an external service like the Russians did, because the Russians inherited the entire Soviet apparatus of the KGB, which included their external. But it was interesting to see that what was going to happen to this very powerful organization, which had its headquarters, many of its own people. Were there going to be cadre changes and the like? Who were they loyal, to Kravchuk and to the political regime, which they appeared to be, or were they becoming more nationalistic? And what was the relationship that they were developing, or not, with the Russian FSB and SBR, but particularly in that relation, because they were basically, first name basis. I mean, when Semichastny was removed by Brezhnev, it was, I believe it was Fedorchuk, head of the Ukrainian service, that became the head of the KGB in Moscow. So that's how close they were. Subsequently, I was a year in Ukraine, then went up to Belarus, which was very interesting because in Belarus, the KGB, which still remains the BKGB, very close to the Russians, so much so that all the KGB directors that I knew and people, when they retired or left, they all went to Moscow, including members of the foreign ministry, which we knew. It was certainly clear that Shushkevich, when he was in head of the parliament, did not control the KGB. And when Lukashenko became president in '94, when I was there, was he going to be in control of the KGB and the like as well? Because I remember that even the KGB, Belarusian KGB, was reporting back to the Soviet or Russian KGB back at the Bialovezha conference, saying, "Well, I've been reporting all this back because that's what I'm supposed to do." So they were very close to the Russians, but on the other hand, they prided themselves on their professionalism. And also, I think over time, when I later came back as ambassador in 2003, the Belarusian KGB was still heavily influenced, but I remember visiting their training facility in Dzerzhinsk because Dzerzhinsky himself was born in what is now Belarus. And there was a training facility there. And the Belarusian KGB were quite proud that they were building a museum at his birthplace, renovated the country house that Dzerzhinsky, his family had. But they were rather critical of their Russian counterparts because they said they all claim Dzerzhinsky as theirs, but he's ours, and they haven't paid a single ruble for our renovation of his birthplace. So there was a certain amount of, their own sort of independence in a way with the Russians and the Belarusians, and that was interesting for me to see. I'd say even when I then went back to the United States, and we were covering the Caucasus, they're a very different operation, very poor. They did not have resources. You had people like Gaidar Aliyev, who was a KGB and head of the KGB, becoming prominent, president and the like as well. Shevardnadze. It was interesting to see how that organization was it going to be used by the regimes that now and the leaders that came in for their own purposes of defending their regimes, which seemed to be very much the case, but they were also prone to the divisions of politics within, for instance, Armenia, Georgia, as well as in Azerbaijan until Aliyev finally assumed control. Turning finally to Central Asia, there too, it seemed all the Russian advisors left, but they became very much close to defending the, to the regimes and the leaderships that they had ahead of them. And interesting what the relationship would be with, the Russians. I would just say finally about the United States that our policy for dealing with these agencies, if you will, were basically taken on by our security agencies like the CIA and others. And it was a matter of like partnership and penetration, which was something some of these services wanted, some of them didn't want. But they liked the resources that the Americans had, and the Americans looked at first how to work together on anti-drug trafficking. It was actually something that Aldrich Ames pioneered in the relationship with these regimes, and then became anti-terrorism and anti-extremism later on, certainly after 9/11. But it was not really considered like what were these regimes doing or how these organizations were in their focus on their domestic control, although that became an issue over human rights and Leahy amendments and things of that nature. So I'll stop on that note. And
okay, thank you very much, George. Louisa.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. And I'm not going to talk about about Vladimir Putin, nor am I going to talk about KGB after the Soviet demise, unless time permits. I have one thing I might say on that. What I'm going to talk about is the KGB's role in domestic repression, and in particular repression of the dissident movement. A couple examples. The dissident movement in the Soviet Union. I should say I was at the Soviet embassy, in the U.S. embassy in Moscow. My first tour, 77 to 1980. For the second half of that tour, I was the embassy officer responsible for contact with the Soviet dissident movement. It was one of the more memorable experiences I had in a very memorable Foreign Service career in many ways. And I'm going to talk about a couple incidents of that. I think looking at the names on our list, I know that many people are familiar with the Soviet dissident movement. It's kind of said to have existed from around 1965 to 1980. I was responsible for contacts towards its end, 1979 to 80. The movement began, often is said to have begun in 65, when two Soviet writers were arrested for sending works abroad. Arresting writers was not at all anything unusual, except maybe that they were arrested and not just shot. But what was really unusual was that the two writers, Sinyavsky and Daniel, did not admit their guilt, resisted in their trial, and also their friends and supporters attended the trial and protested, and the protests out of that trial kind of spawned the dissident movement. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. Two important things which affected me directly. One was the so-called Chronicle of Current Events, an underground dissident journal, which remarkably appeared for a number of years, despite the KGB's intense efforts to crush it. From the late 60s until 1981 or so, it appeared regularly with 2 years of a gap. The work of a number of succession of brave and skillful people evading for a time the repression of the KGB, but at the end, all of the editors eventually were arrested. And the final thing to mention, in a way, setting the backdrop, is for what I want to talk about more, is the Helsinki Agreement, 1975. It's kind of a commonplace, and I think true, that the Helsinki Agreement, which was critically important in the spread and survival of the dissident movement, for the first time, albeit in a very limited way, the Soviet government acknowledged the legitimacy of human rights as a subject for diplomatic discourse. When President Carter sent a letter to Andrei Sakharov, I'll speak about in a minute, Brezhnev complained to him, and Carter said, "Well, you signed the Helsinki Agreement, so it's legitimate." And that's pretty well known. Another thing that happened, important, but less well known, but significant in the operation of the dissident movement, and for me personally, after this happened, the U.S. Congress formed something called the CSCE Commission, and it was, in that long ago era, a truly bipartisan commission with a mandate to follow and report on the progress of Helsinki agreements in various countries, including the Soviet Union. And what this did was the CSE Commission, as a U.S. government body meant that information, it was made it really much easier for the dissidents and people like me, embassy officers responsible for reporting on them, to send back reports. I think I was the third member, the diplomat in the embassy, to have this assignment of following the dissident community. And originally there were, within the Foreign Service, within the senior ranks sometimes, not a lot of questioning whether this was really a legitimate function. Malcolm Toon, probably many people, particularly Tom, I think, knows him, remembers him well. A crusty old guy, PT boat commander in World War II, had a reputation as a hardliner on the Soviet Union, which I think is well deserved, and I think it's a deserving reputation. But he was very skeptical about whether diplomats ought to be out there in the streets contacting dissidents as opposed to people in foreign ministry. Once the CSE Commission was established, that kind of went by the boards. This is going to go anyway. And we collected large amounts of information, and it went back to the State Department in the diplomatic pouch, and went to the commission and other and was published, basically, a lot of it. And it was an important element in the spread of the dissident movement, including the chronicle of current events. When the chronicle would come out every 2 months, when a new edition was coming out, I would get word of it through a couple cutouts, and I'd meet at some point in Moscow, and I would get an envelope with 2 copies of the Chronicle, and it would go back to Washington. They had other channels as well, journalists and another foreign diplomat. I don't know who he was, but I know they had one other. So the role of the diplomatic observers is important in aspects of the dissident community. And I'd like to speak about one of the men who I knew, and that's Andrei Sakharov. Andrei Sakharov, almost everybody here I'm sure knows, father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, as a young theoretical physicist, and on the basis of that, a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences at a very early age, a member at the highest level of the Soviet establishment, scientific and elite establishment. It's said to the very end, until he was exiled, that he had the right to drive and be driven in an Academy of Sciences limousine. Although I have to say, I never saw him in one. Sakharov was without a doubt the single most impressive human being I ever met, of any category. When you entered his presence, his intelligence was evident in everything he said and did, but also his integrity, almost his saintliness in a way, and it was something as I said, I'll never forget, and I'll never the privilege of getting to know this man. I'll spend two incidents in this which illustrate something of the role of what we played and something about him. I was the last American diplomat to see him. He was, and I guess maybe the second to last time I saw him. He went wherever he went. He traveled with a battered leather briefcase, and he pulled out of this briefcase small, tightly ripped package wrapped in newspapers and handed it to me, opened it up and handed it to me. And it was a collection of papers full of tightly written script, and which was the first half of his memoirs. Sakharov's memoirs were published in the early 80s. And he said to me, Lewis, I know the KGB, trying to get this back to the ostensible subject of this talk, KGB is circling, and I know they're gonna arrest me soon, and I want you to get this out for me. And I did. I think the recipient of it, I'm looking at Tatiana Yakovlevich's name among the participants in this meeting. She was one of the. She eventually got to her. I should say, in terms of speaking to Sakharov, initially his house, his flat was bugged. Of course, he knew it. Everybody knew it. Wherever he went, he was followed. We tried to speak. They often use these little notebooks that the children use. You can write a note on it, lift it up, and then it goes away. And he tried to use that with me, and I could not read his Russian script. So we spoke in whispers. Whether that deterred the KGB or not, I have no idea, but I doubt it did. And the second time, next time I saw him, and I believe this was the last time, he again repeated he thought that arrest was imminent, and he pulled out another package from his battered briefcase, and this time handed it to me. This time it was pretty heavy. It was his Nobel Peace Prize, a gold, about a 5-inch in diameter gold medallion. Gold is probably, many of you know, is very heavy. Sorry, and gave it to me, and that also got out, and I have no idea where it is now, but shortly thereafter, I was on a trip to Gorky with another foreign minister and an embassy colleague, and we learned that Sakharov had been exiled to Gorky. I never saw him again. When I heard this, I had two reactions. One, sadness, obviously, for him, regret for him, but also what a sign of weakness in the system that was. Sakharov, a brilliant man, had brilliant service to his country, and was perfect. He was in many ways, he was a Russian, a patriot of his country. He was not a fan of the communist system, especially as it involved. And the system was simply, when it came to either accepting and using the resources this man had, and tolerating some of the questions he would raise about the system's choice was basically to remove him. And that, I think, is in a not just a small way, one of the reasons why it did collapse. That's one reason. I don't know how much time I have left.
You're near the end, Louis. So 1 minute.
I will. What question? Significance of the dissident movement. Sakharov, of course, came back. He was brought back from exile under Gorbachev. If anybody's interested in a very interesting story about how he was brought back, you can ask me a question. I'll tell you about that. But the significance of the movement. It was a relatively small number of people, maybe 1,500, 2,000 names are known to assign various protests movements. In my second tour of Moscow, 1991 and 94, where I had the political section, it was not uncommon to meet people. And this was the heyday of the democratic era in Russia, the Yeltsin era, who would say, well, I wasn't a dissident, but I really kind of sympathized with their objectives. And maybe that was true, maybe it was not. I'm sure it was true of a lot of people. One other individual, however, that I knew in the dissident era shows some of its significance. A man named Vyacheslav Bakhmin, I believe Slav is still alive. Bakhmin and others headed the committee for publicizing Soviet abuses of psychiatry for political repression. Some dissidents were sent to psychiatric prisons. It was the most feared and in some ways the most terrible of the repressive mechanisms. Slava became a friend. He would come to our apartment. He was arrested shortly before I left. He was sentenced in 80 or 81 to 3 years imprisonment. His contacts with diplomats and foreigners figured in his trial, so I'm told. I next saw Slava Bakhmin in 1992, back in my second tour of Moscow. And
Louis, I'm gonna need to follow
two sentences and I'll stop. I saw Slava, this foreign diplomat. He was a deputy foreign minister for human rights. And so that says something about the impact. It says something about Slava, that the first thing he brought up with me was human rights abuses in the United States and in the American embassy, namely in the visa section. So
okay, thank you, Louis. Let me very quickly, before I turn to Tom Simons, mention I am here at the Davis Center in charge of another seminar series named after Sakharov, the Sakharov Seminars on Human Rights. And Tatiana Yankelevich, who was the stepdaughter of Sakharov, the daughter of Yelena Bonner, Sakharov's wife, was the founding organizer of that seminar series, and she has been involved in numerous events that we have had dealing with Sakharov. Let me add that there is a very recent history of the dissident movement by Benjamin Nathans that's come out, and I'll be hosting a seminar with him in the spring semester. So there will be many opportunities to come back to these topics. Please, Tom Simons.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I thought the presentations were fascinating. I think they're especially rich when it came to the KGB role in society over this turbulent period and in transition. But I would like Louis, I have no personal contact with Putin, but I'd still like to talk about Putin while we wait for Andrew Goodman's book on being a diplomat in the land of the KGB, which we have that to look forward to down the road. On Putin, though, some years ago, I attended a seminar at the Davis Center by a woman named Brenda Connors. She is a former dancer turned scholar. She's been in various institutions. She is now, I think, at Indiana University at Bloomington. And she had spent years watching film of Putin's physical movements in a whole variety of settings. And her conclusions, and thinking about what the way he moved, what it meant about him. And her conclusions were along the following lines. Putin often holds his right arm rigid as he walks. And she connected that with his fixation on physical strength and prowess, the the swimming, the riding, all those things that he does so proudly. And at the downstream or upstream, she felt that could even denote a birth defect. In other words, he was born with some kind of physical disability, which of course would also make him want to excel in physical activities. And she also felt that these physical traits could in turn help explain a number of things about Putin as an actor in the public realm. He's a very good listener, it turns out. He listens long and carefully. And he's also slow to make decisions. Now, George has given us examples of how decisive he was up there in St. Petersburg or Leningrad, as it then was, and what a relief it was for people to work for him. But her following him through the years said he's a very good listener, but slow to make decisions. But once he's made decisions, he's very unwilling to reverse bad decisions once they are made. In other words, he tends to double down on decisions, even if they were unwise. Now, I think her approach to this is not conclusive, but I think it's also fascinating stuff. And I cite it here because one of the ways to analyze Putin, and I think my colleagues are sympathetic to this approach, is to portray him as a kind of monster in waiting who was formed early and is lurking there and preparing for developments that provide him with opportunities to strike to restore Russian greatness. I mean, that's one fairly widespread way of looking at him. And no doubt there's something to that. I mean, clearly the forces that took Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008, the forces that took Crimea and invaded the Donbass in 2014, and the forces that launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, these were already prepared. They were there to be utilized when the time came. But I've also been impressed with two things about Putin. First, I've been impressed not so much with how little he's changed over the years, but how much he's changed over the years. From the era of cooperation with the US after 9/11, that slow march through the color revolutions, the Orange Revolution, the Tulip Revolution, the Rose Revolution, leading to the speech in Munich in 2007. But that after that speech, you would say the die is cast, but there was also an effort to reset relations when Medvedev was the nominal president. And that went on until the turmoil that followed the fixed election of 2012. So that's one thing. I've been impressed with how much change there is on his record. Second, though, there have been instances, I think, that look to me like panic moves. In other words, unnecessary decisions taken in moments of stress. The first one I identified was when he declared Abkhazia and South Ossetia states after the 2008 crisis, an unnecessary move which constrained his options, I think, unnecessarily. Of course, the most spectacular was the move to take Crimea back and to launch the little green men into the Donbass in 2014. He thought, as I understand it, he thought they had a deal in Ukraine to keep Yanukovych in power till you had elections in the fall. And he felt that whoever was moving things, which he interpreted as the United States, had reneged on that deal when Ukrainian security forces said they could no longer protect Yanukovych and he had to flee into Russian exile. Putin talked about that just this last week. He referred once again to that betrayal in 2014. And he sounded like Trump, whining about the way he's been betrayed and persecuted through his life. Now, Putin may still be the monster in waiting that many people see in him. Some of my colleagues, I think, are sympathetic. And he clearly doubles down on bad decisions. He does not. He hates to change a decision once made, as Brenda Connors discerned. But he does learn from mistakes, as Andrew has told us and documented for us. And so the record shows, I think, a lot of change as well. Thank you. I can't hear you. You're not, I can't hear you.
Mark, I believe you're muted.
You're muted. I'm muted. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So the what is a problem here? Okay, I hope that you can hear me now. So let me, if I could just, there are questions that have come in and I want to turn to those, but let me just start with one quick question, if I could. This may be mostly for Andrew and George. Could you comment briefly on the role of Yevgeny Primakov, who was important throughout the rise of Putin? I don't know whether he had any connection with it, whether he was uncomfortable with it, but Primakov had become who was a KGB officer himself, even though he didn't really serve in the agency. But he had been head of IMEMO, the Institute for International Economy and International Relations, and then during the Gorbachev period was elevated to the Politburo. And then as the KGB was being separated into its components, first by Gorbachev, after the August 1991 coup, and then by Yeltsin after Russia took over the agency. Primakov was the one who was placed in charge of what is now the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia. It had a different name back then. I think the Central Intelligence Corps. And then he also, though, was kept on by Yeltsin after the breakup of the Soviet Union as head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, I think well into the mid-1990s until around 1996, and then became foreign minister under Yeltsin, and then for a brief while in 1999 was prime minister and was the predecessor of Putin. So given Primakov's importance in the intelligence sphere, as well as then becoming a senior political figure, what was his connection, if any, with Putin during this period? Before I have you address that issue, let me turn to at least one of the questions that have come in. This one is from Anna Gambord. She asked, how did the retreat of Nazarbayev in 2019 affect Kazakhstan's relations with the Russian intelligence services and any remnants of the KGB present in Kazakhstan itself? I'm not sure who would want to address that, maybe George, but let me turn back to you, especially to Andrew and George for these initial questions, and then I'll come to questions for Louis and Tom. Please, Andrew first.
Well, I'm not aware that there was any real relationship between Putin and Primakov. What really became clear, I think, when Putin moved to Moscow, is he brought with him his own, if you want to put it this way, as people have, his own personal mafia. In other words, it was the St. Petersburg mafia that Putin brought to power. And the previous prime ministers and everything, they were, in essence, they were rivals to Putin, and he pushed them out. So as George said, the KGB had many different factions in it. And what you have when Putin takes over is the domination of a St. Petersburg faction. And all the people who basically rose to power are all people who were associated with Putin in St. Petersburg. And so, it's possible that because that at least Putin and Primakov would not have been adversaries in the sense that Putin was showing his loyalty to the Moscow administration. But once Putin got to Moscow, Putin was intent upon pushing everybody there out of the way, just the way he did in St. Petersburg. He pushed everybody out of the way, regardless of what their affiliation had been before. And with that, George, you may know more about this than I do.
I would say that from my experience being in Moscow later at the embassy, but also as director of Russian affairs at state before that, it seemed to be clear to me that while Primakov and Vladimir Putin may not have known each other very much in the Leningrad days or like, certainly when Vladimir Putin came to Moscow, they knew each other quite well and sympathized with each other. I think it's also worth pointing out that Anatoly Sobchak, very early on, I mean, he thought that the Belovezh Forest dissolution of the Soviet Union was idiocy and said so many times, which I think Vladimir Putin has reiterated as well, being that they were very close in the sense that the Soviet Union should have been preserved in a different form, perhaps, but the domination, or at least leadership of Russia, as they would put it, in this sphere was quite important. And that's what Primakov believed very much so. And I think that Primakov and Putin were extremely sympathetic to each other, met, I would imagine, on many occasions. When Primakov died, Vladimir Putin paid great honor and respect to him as being someone bringing Russia back to its greatness. Primakov, I think, from his own training, and I'd say, as Mark, you have mentioned, there were many people from the Soviet era, including people like the current president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, Aliyev, Shevardnadze, others came out of this, and as well as the longtime foreign minister of Uzbekistan, Kamilov, where they were experts trained often in the Middle East or in China in the case of Tokayev, but came out of that cradle. And also, but for Primakov, it was also a matter of basically standing up to the Americans. But also, I remember Primakov was also an extremely good listener and was contemplative, but he knew his talking points, and he was strong all the times dealing with Madeleine Albright, extremely polite as Vladimir Putin is, with certainly foreign, a number of foreign leaders, certainly with American leaders and the like as well. Listen, but would have a strong opinion of what they felt was in Russia's interest, and it wasn't coinciding with being simply a secondary player to the United States. So I think that they had a great deal of sympathy, if not a personal friendship by the time, and professional friendship by the time that Vladimir Putin came to Moscow. As far as the question on Nazarbayev, that's an interesting one. I could go on at length because the Kazakhstani service was extremely close, I think, to the Russian service. I'm training as well as cadres and things like that. But as Nazarbayev always had to play a very delicate line, it was also a delicate line of dealing with his security service, the KGB, and always made sure that he would have even family members, like his nephew was the #2 for the long time, and including and finally Masimov, who was extremely his loyal sort of person in that he would put in there at the end, and that even after Nazarbayev left the presidency and became kind of the supernumerary leader of the nation, of the Nazi, Masimov and all the security forces answered to him, not to Tokayev. And also that Masimov and you know, at the time that he was the head of the KGB, was also you know, meeting with the Americans, had talked about wanting to model the KGB on the American sort of intelligence system and security system and the like. And I can only imagine that this bothered the Russians greatly at the time, and because of the flirtation that Masimov and the KGB might have been having. I mean, it was also interesting that while Nazarbayev was in office as president, there were some members of his leadership staff who were removed and dismissed, and there was the implication that they were removed because they were in the service of a quote unquote foreign power. There was, perhaps it was never outright said, was that foreign power, you know, to the north. It seemed that may have been the case. So I think that after Nazarbayev's sort of now removal from power, it'd be interesting that whether the KGB and also Masimov being arrested for treason, of whether or not the service is yet closer to Russia as a result of this under Tokayev, but I always imagine that they want to be and maneuver themselves to be as independent as possible, but recognizing sort of the pressures they're under from their northern neighbor and maybe even from their neighbor to the east.
Yeah, please, George. Andrew, sorry.
Thanks. I just want to say one thing. I think we have to remember here the difference between rivalries over political issues, to which to a large extent there were not among the Russian elite, versus personal rivalries. Putin's immediate predecessor, Stepashin, as prime minister, had been head of the KGB, and when he was pushed out, sort of said, "Why is my friend doing this to me?" Primakov was a candidate to become president and a rival to Putin in the 2000 election, and he withdrew in support of Putin. So Putin relied on the fact and gained support on the fact that most of the Russian elite shared his views as to the direction policy should take, and he used them. But that was separate from the issue of, so I would say, personal aggrandizement and controlling the actual apparatus. Putin had his friends doing that. He relied on all kinds of other people to service it because they all shared the same views. But there is a difference there between, a political disagreement versus a personal disagreement. And I think when Tom was quoting that Putin was a good listener, Putin always reserved his judgments. He tended to speak ambiguously. This is why people associated him with vastly different points of view. Once he, as he said to me, he was a man of his word. And what he meant by that, not that he meant he always told the truth, everything he pronounced as true, but what he meant by it is, when I say something that I'm going to do something, I do it. And that's part of the problem of him being unwilling to bend, and also part of the problem of him, again, how he takes over. You proved your loyalty the same way other politicians have expected people to be loyal. That doesn't mean they get advancement from it. His advancement is limited very carefully to close servants who work very closely with him and have proved their loyalty. Now, recently, there are some examples of people who've gotten into his inner circle by abandoning all their previous viewpoints and proving their loyalty by acting as enforcers for him. But the original enforcers are all still in control of the Russian economy and the Russian political apparatus. And that, I think, is the difference. In other words, there's an agreement on politics, but that doesn't change the personal rivalry and the issue of who actually controls things. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Let me turn to, there are several more questions that have come in from the audience. So let me, first of all, just say to Louis Sal, I have words of appreciation for your comments about Sakharov from Tatiana Yankelevich, who will be in touch with you as well for Sakharov's stepdaughter. And then she also, though, asked a question that I'm going to direct to Tom, which is she asks about what was it? You referred to the changes in Putin, and she refers as well to the time when Putin seemed to be talking about the friendship with the United States in the aftermath of the September 2001 terrorist attacks, and seemed to be referring to his desire to remake the Russian economy in a way that would work better, as in fact it did happen in large part as a result of increased prices of oil, global prices of oil, but also of certain important reforms made early on. But then how did he shift then, Tom, as you described, to this much more wildly anti-Western, xenophobic rhetoric, and the policy changes as well that you referred to in Crimea and before that in Georgia. And so what do you think, she asked in particular, was it something to do with Western policy, or do you see it as much more internally driven? And there is a second question as well from a different questioner who asks, and this may be a little bit off the subject, but it's certainly, I think, a question that we can address, is the changes that have taken place this year in the U.S. State Department under Secretary of State Rubio and President Trump that have basically reoriented the State Department to something quite different in policy toward Russia, particularly the effort to dismantle the agencies that had long been in place to counter Russian disinformation and to try to project a message of support for democracy. How do you think that will affect the tenacity of the successor agencies to the KGB? That's a separate question. So let me turn first to Tom to deal with the question about changes in Putin.
I think it was a slow accumulation of negative developments from his point of view. I think it's probably accurate to say that his underlying impulse is to restore Russian greatness vis-a-vis neighbors and vis-a-vis the outside world. I think feeling weak when he came to power, I think he was very careful about pursuing Russian greatness. I think he was willing to improve and stabilize relations with the United States. I think there's mixed evidence on his reaction to 9/11. One report, I think Fred Starr talks about this. He was calling the Central Asian leaders, encouraging them to not support the United States, before he then turned 180 degrees and was the first to call George W. Bush with a statement of support. But I think, first of all, over time, the Bush administration made clear that it was not willing to see Russia reestablish hegemony over its neighbors. In other words, that was not part of the way we envisaged a relationship with Russia. I think Well, that was one thing. And then you got the steady accumulation of these color revolutions in Russia's neighbors, which I think over time gave Putin grounds for thinking that he was facing a US policy of regime change, which would eventually get to him. There you got the Munich speech not declaring war on the West, but declaring the West was at war with Russia. Even so, after that, then you got the Bucharest Statement in 2008, where the United States pressed for these preliminary greetings. I forget what they're called now.
Membership action program.
Membership action program as a stepping stone on the way to NATO membership. And and that was the president himself. I asked one of the policymakers, how can you send an American president into a meeting where he's going to lose? Because we already knew that the French and the Germans were not going to accept those agreements. But he got this statement saying Georgia and Ukraine will be NATO members without anything backing it up in terms of next steps. But very shortly after that, you had, I think, a foolish attempt by the Georgian leadership to surprise the Russians in South Ossetia, which then got a smashback from the Russians. So I think it was accumulation of issues. Moreover, under the Clinton administration, as we were moving toward NATO expansion, there was a genuine effort to give Russia a stake in a new security system in Europe, which would include East European membership and Baltic membership in NATO. That was the NATO-Russian Council in Brussels. That was the PFP thing as a kind of as an alternative to NATO membership, popular with the Defense Department. And that effort was dropped after 9/11 by the Bush administration, by the Bush, the younger administration. So I think it was a combination and accumulation of negative steps for Russia that I think turned Putin into his conviction that he was facing a war with the West, an attack on Russia's effort to regain its rightful place in the international order. And I think that kind of locked him in to a situation that...
Andrew, did you want to add something, please?
Yeah, please. I have to disagree with you, Tom. I held numerous conversations with Putin about his attitude towards the West and to world politics. And I've published several articles on this. Putin never, ever trusted the West. He only felt, and he said this to me categorically, the West would only help Russia insofar as it served Western interests. Putin also said he didn't trust Western businessmen. They were trying to get profits. They were never doing anything that was going to be in Russia's interest. And yes, he changed his policy. He thought it was necessary, absolutely necessary for Russia to learn from the West, acquire Western help for its economy. But at a certain point, Russia would have to strike out on its own because the West would not grant Russia the status that the Soviet Union had enjoyed. So Putin went along with the West until he thought and he found that he was definitely not going to get what he wanted. Putin, by the way, I can also tell you that his view on terrorism was extremely genuine. Again, from conversations that I had with him. He also thought, and this I'm just extrapolating from his statements, that by helping the United States after 9/11, which he did, in opposition to a lot of Russian politicians, that he would be rewarded finally by the United States by treating him as an equal. That, of course, did not happen. And that ultimately, as you then said, led to 2007, led to the statement that, okay, I'm not going to get this from the West no matter what I do. Therefore, I have to act on my own. And then you have, yes, a string of continued events that he would view as insults to his position. And Putin was very sensitive to insults in his position. But it's one thing in terms of changing your tactics and what you're doing, as opposed to your original attitude. The original attitude was a very, very old line Soviet attitude. Putin had it, and he exhibited it in countless conversations that I had with him, and he made no bones about it. He said, I'm doing this because it's the only way to restore Russia's strength, but I do not trust the West. And one would say, I think he was proven correct in that. Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
Please, please, Tom, and then Louis.
no, I don't see a contradiction between my point of view and Andrew's. I mean, I think probably Putin has had this major impulse to restore Russian greatness, but was willing to work with the West in pursuit of that, but then faced a series of disappointments in a whole variety of areas, which narrowed down his willingness to cooperate with the West. But Afghanistan, the northern distribution route by which we supplied Afghanistan, because we didn't want the Pakistanis to hold us up, that was a gift from Putin too. So he has a record of being willing to change positions, maybe tactical, but change nonetheless, which I don't think should be forgotten.
Louis?
A small point, not on this most recent discussion, interesting as it is, but on Putin and his character. Struck by a comment some time ago by Andrew, Putin as a man of his word, or at least wanting to present that kind of image. When in my second tour, I got the chance to meet and know Yeltsin and the people around him fairly well for a time. And as people probably know, when Yeltsin anointed Putin as a successor, it was said, rumored, reported that one aspect of that arrangement was that Putin would not touch Yeltsin and his family. And I have a couple of conversations over the years with a foreign businessman, with someone else close to Yeltsin, extensive interest across Russia, and his take was that Putin has actually followed that he's not tried to take any actions against the family, left them alone. He did what he said for whatever reason.
Okay. Let me, because we don't have much time left, let me ask whether anyone wants to address the impact of recent changes in the U.S. State Department and U.S. policy toward Russia. I mean, I know what my own view is. I've been alarmed by, say, the dismantling of various U.S. agencies like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the Voice of America, the attempt to disband the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as the dismantling of various elements that were set up to try to counter Russian disinformation. All of that has been done in such an aggressive and purposeful way that it really makes me very concerned. But then there are also the cuts in the State Department. So if anyone wants to say a quick word about any of this, please do.
It's like the end of
please, Andrew, and then Louis, and then Tom, and then George. So, and then we'll have to end. Please, Andrew.
Seems to be part of Putin's master plan to destabilize the United States.
Please, Louis.
I'll say something, but I think Tom should speak first, really.
It's like the question of to Joe and Live, the effect of the French Revolution. I think it's too early to tell.
George?
Okay, I will say something. I mean, that I wanted Tom to go first. Sean Lively, he said that after 200 years, so I think we'll see the impact sooner than that. I think that the State Department and the Foreign Service needed some change, frankly. But it may well have been too big, or may well have needed some reorientation. But little, if anything, that Trump or his people have done anything positive to address those changes, nor is it ever conceivable that they could. And my last comment is, and looking at all of us here as members of the Foreign Service of the Cold War generation, and I'll say this, I say it bluntly, we won the Cold War, and that's a good thing. And the Trump administration is reversing all of that. He's undoing all of what we as an institution and what we as a people achieved.
I would largely agree with that. I mean, when I look at the disregard of U.S. allies in Europe and in East Asia, or the almost antagonism of them in efforts to cozy up to at least some U.S. adversaries, especially Russia. It really dismays me. George, do you want to have a final comment here?
Well, like Tom and Louis have said, I think that it's an opportunity perhaps for some critical thinking about what we were doing and what our policies and the institutions for dealing with Russia. Because if we're talking about Russia, but also democracy and all of these things that the institutions, the mindsets came out of the Cold War and continued from the Cold War. And I remember when I was in the service, it was very difficult to get some very critical thinking within the State Department or the U.S. government, or even in maybe in academia, it's more possible about really what is it working? Is any of this really achieving what were its goals and the like? And so on the one hand, you can again get rid of it all, but what if anything can or should replace it, which is an opportunity. I don't see any thought being given to, well, how do we address these things, such as a country like Russia or China or whatever, and what are the tools and what are the policies we have? Because it's kind of like Topsy, it just grew, and without really any systematic rationale to it. And so there's an opportunity here. I don't see whether or not the thinking that go on of, okay, what then can replace it as far as something that's more effective as dealing with allies, other than simply repeating the nostrums of the past, the liberal international order. Well, what does it mean? Does it work? Did it work? So that's my comment about this. Yes, there's a need for change and reform, as there was all the time, but there was never seriously. And now, what will come of this is a matter of time to tell. Will there be any serious thinking about a plan of, okay, then how do we organize ourselves and man this newer world where there are powerful countries with powerful interests, and we have to deal and manage our own selves within this this new environment.
Thank you, George. That will be the final word. Let me just say, with regard to the liberal international order, as political Michael Barnett, a political scientist, put it, Trump huffed and puffed, and the liberal international order blew over. So, in any case, I do want to thank all of the speakers today for their excellent presentations and also for sticking to the time, amazingly enough. I also want to thank Laura Sargent for coordinating it and making it technically possible to do. So thank you, everyone.